Hello.
The knock on my door was sudden and insistent, cutting through the quiet evening like a blade. I hadn't been expecting anyone, and for a split second, a wave of irrational panic washed over me. The apartment was bathed in soft light, with the last bits of daylight slipping through the blinds, casting long shadows on the floor. I held a half-finished glass of wine in one hand and my phone in the other. I made my way across the room, pausing for just a moment before unlocking the door. When I opened it, the sight in front of me was both familiar and unsettling. There, sitting on the cold concrete step outside, was my nephew. His elbow rested on his knee as he scrolled absent-mindedly through his phone. A small duffel bag sat at his feet. He looked up at me, and for a moment, his expression was unreadable. Then, as if something clicked, he smiled. "Mom said you'd help," he said, as casually as though this were the most normal request. I froze for a moment, caught between disbelief and frustration. "She didn't even call," I muttered under my breath, stepping aside to let him in. "She's been busy," he replied, dragging his bag into the apartment without waiting for me to say anything more. The door clicked shut, and suddenly there was an uncomfortable silence, pressing down on me like a weight. I pulled out my phone and called my sister. The first call went unanswered. So did the second. By the third, she finally picked up. Her voice sounded rushed, frazzled, and heavy with that familiar mixture of guilt and desperation that I had grown accustomed to. "Look, I'm sorry," she began before I could speak. I didn't have time to explain. "Things are a mess. I just need some time. He'll only be with you for the summer." "Summer?" My voice spiked. "I can't take care of a teenager. You know how busy I am." "He's not a kid anymore," she cut in. "He's independent. He'll be fine. You won't even notice he's there." I glanced over at him. He was standing in the middle of my living room, scanning the space with a quiet curiosity. He didn't look like the gangly kid I remembered. At 19, he was taller than me now, lean yet solid, and his posture was way too relaxed for someone who'd just been dropped off unceremoniously on a relative's doorstep. "This isn't fair," I said quietly. "Please," she said, her tone softening. "I just need this one favor. I'll sort everything out soon. I promise." The line went dead before I could respond. I sighed and turned back to him. "Well," I said, trying to sound firm, "I guess you're here now." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he gave me a half-smile that seemed almost amused. "Don't worry," he said. "I'm not here to make your life harder." His words made me feel defensive, as though I'd been accused of something without even realizing it. "Your room's down the hall. Second door on the right," I said, keeping my voice short. He nodded, grabbed his bag, and disappeared down the hallway. Once he was out of sight, I collapsed into the nearest chair. My mind raced. This wasn't part of the plan. My life was usually so carefully organized. Every hour accounted for between work, errands, and the quiet time I'd grown to depend on. Having him here had thrown all that out of balance. A faint creak from the hallway pulled me from my thoughts. He appeared again moments later, standing just inside the living room. "Thanks for letting me stay," he said, his voice softer this time. I nodded, unsure how to respond. It felt awkward. "It's temporary," I said. He didn't argue. Instead, he looked around again, his eyes lingering on the bookshelves, the worn-out couch, the cluttered coffee table. "Nice place," he said simply, then disappeared back into the hallway. Later that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that this summer was going to be anything but simple. The stillness of the apartment seemed heavier, like his presence had shifted the air, making it harder to breathe. For the first time in ages, I felt like my life was on the verge of something unfamiliar. Morning came quietly, with soft light filtering through the half-open curtains. I woke to the sound of cupboards opening in the kitchen. It was strange to hear someone else moving around in the apartment, something I'd grown used to keeping silent. For a moment, I considered staying in bed and pretending it wasn't real, but curiosity, and maybe a sense of responsibility, got the better of me. When I walked into the kitchen, there he was, my nephew, standing by the counter, casually sipping from a mug, steam rising from it and filling the room with the rich scent of coffee. He was already dressed, his hair still damp from a shower. Again, I was struck by how much he had changed since the last time I saw him. "Morning," he said, noticing me standing by the doorway. I nodded, unsure of how to react. Mornings were usually my time, quiet moments to prepare myself mentally for the day ahead. Now, there was another presence in the space, and it felt intrusive, though not intentionally so. "I made some for you too," he added, gesturing to a second mug on the counter. It was a small gesture, but it threw me off. I couldn't remember the last time anyone had made me coffee, and it felt unexpectedly personal. "Thanks," I said, walking over to pick it up. The mug was warm in my hands, and I took a cautious sip. It was perfect, smooth, rich, not the usual bitter instant stuff I rushed through. "I figured you could use a proper cup," he said casually, as if reading my mind. "You don't seem like the type to make time for that." I frowned at the remark. "What's that supposed to mean?" He shrugged, his face unreadable. "Just an observation." His calmness unnerved me. He was so sure of himself, so composed in a way that didn't match the kid I remembered. I wanted to snap back, to remind him this was my space, my life, but I didn't. Instead, I took another sip of my coffee, feeling his presence more than ever. The rest of the day passed with little interaction. I went to work, throwing myself into my routine, hoping it would help shake the odd feeling that had settled in. When I came home, the apartment was quiet again. His shoes were by the door, a reminder that I wasn't alone, but he was nowhere to be found. Later, as I settled on the couch with my laptop, he reappeared, leaning against the doorway to the living room. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were focused. "Busy day?" he asked. I looked up, startled by his sudden appearance. "Yes," I said curtly, hoping he'd get the hint and leave me to my work. Instead, he walked into the room and perched himself on the armrest of the couch, just out of my immediate line of sight. "You always work this late?" he asked. "Yes," I replied again, sharper this time. "It's part of the job." He didn't respond right away, and for a second, I wondered if he was going to drop the topic altogether. But then he spoke up, saying, "Doesn't leave much room for anything else, does it?" I put my laptop down, feeling a sudden wave of irritation. "What are you trying to say?" I asked. He smiled faintly, as though my reaction amused him. "Nothing. Just thought you might need a break every now and then." The nerve of him took me by surprise. "I don't need your advice," I shot back, my voice sharper than I meant it to be. He raised his hands in mock surrender. "All right, just trying to make conversation." We both fell silent for a moment, the tension thick between us. I was about to tell him to leave when he spoke again. "You've changed, you know," he said quietly. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I stared at him, unsure how to respond. "Changed how?" I finally asked. Before I could say anything more, he stood up and crossed the room. He paused for a moment, locking eyes with me. Then, without another word, he leaned down and kissed my cheek, soft, quick, and completely unexpected. I barely had time to react. By the time I processed what had just happened, he was already heading back to his room. "Good night," he called over his shoulder, his voice calm and steady. I sat there for what felt like ages, my mind racing. It wasn't just the kiss, it was everything about him. The way he carried himself, the way his gaze seemed to understand things I hadn't even admitted to myself. It was disorienting, unsettling, and for reasons I couldn't quite put into words, it stuck with me long after I went to bed. That night, sleep wouldn't come. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the whole moment in my mind. It wasn't just the kiss, it was how he did it. No uncertainty.
He seemed so sure of himself, of me.
And somehow, that left me questioning everything. When I got home that evening, the weight of the day seemed to press down on me. The office had been relentless, and all I wanted as I climbed the stairs to my apartment was the peace of my quiet sanctuary behind the door. But instead, I was greeted by muffled laughter and the unmistakable thud of loud music. I paused in the hallway, hand hovering over the doorknob. For a split second, I wondered if I'd mistakenly walked into the wrong building.
But no.
This was my apartment, my key fit, and the unmistakable sounds of a party confirmed what I'd already suspected. I opened the door, greeted by the chaos inside, shoes scattered across the entryway, jackets thrown over the backs of dining chairs, and unfamiliar voices echoing down the hall toward his room. I dropped my bag on the nearest surface and made my way down the hall. His door was ajar, and I could hear the noise, multiple voices talking over each other, interrupted by bursts of laughter. I knocked loudly once before pushing the door open. Inside, there were 3 of them. My nephew was sitting on the edge of his bed, a half-smile playing on his lips as he animatedly gestured toward his friends. The other 2, a boy and a girl, were sprawled across the floor, surrounded by empty soda cans and snack wrappers. The air was thick with the smell of chips and overly sweet energy drinks. I stood in the doorway, arms crossed, waiting for someone to notice me. When no one did, I cleared my throat. "Hey," I said sharply. "Can we turn it down a little? I just got home and need some quiet." My nephew looked up, his expression calm but amused, as if I'd asked them to perform a miracle. "Sure," he said, nodding, though his tone didn't exactly match his words. I stood there for a moment longer, narrowing my eyes at him before turning to walk back down the hall. The noise continued, barely muffled by the walls. I tried distracting myself by cleaning up the kitchen, then settled on the couch with my laptop. But the laughter and thumping music kept pulling my focus away. For the second time that evening, I stood up, marched down the hall, and knocked again, harder this time. I didn't wait for a response before opening the door. "I thought we agreed to keep it down," I said, my voice firmer now. He looked at me, irritation flickering in his eyes. "We're just talking. It's not anything crazy." "Talking doesn't usually sound like a nightclub," I shot back. One of his friends snickered, and I noticed the girl whisper something to him, her eyes glancing at me briefly before they both laughed. My nephew didn't say a word, just shrugged, which only added to my frustration. "I mean it," I said, my voice rising. "Keep it down." Then once again I turned on my heel and left. By the time I returned to my laptop, my nerves were shot. The noise still blared, as though my earlier interruptions had only made it more entertaining for them. The music was louder now, and laughter came more frequently, the bass faintly vibrating through the walls. I tried to block it out, gripping the edges of my laptop and pretending the words on the screen mattered, but it didn't last. By the 3rd time I marched down the hall, I wasn't bothering to knock. I swung the door open with more force than I meant to, startling all 3 of them. My nephew looked up at me, clearly annoyed now, but I didn't give him a chance to speak. "I've already been in here twice," I said, my voice trembling with frustration. "This is the 3rd time I've asked you to keep your guests down in my house, and I shouldn't have to remind you to be respectful." His friends exchanged awkward glances. The girl muttered something under her breath, but this time, I didn't care. My nephew just stared at me, his usual calm demeanor now tinged with something else. His response was quick, though his tone was clipped. "Well, turn it down," he said, his defiance clear. I paused in the doorway, letting the silence stretch between us, before I finally stepped out and shut the door with a quiet thud behind me. For a while, the apartment was quieter, but it didn't last long. The music gradually rose again, softer but still there, blending with the occasional bursts of laughter. By the 4th time, I'd had enough of trying to play nice. I shoved the door open, my patience completely worn out. "Can you just stop this already?" I snapped, louder than I meant to. The room fell into an immediate, heavy silence. All 3 of them stared at me, stunned by my outburst. I stood there in the doorway, arms crossed tightly over my chest, glaring at them. "I've asked you 3 times. 3 times to turn it down," I said, each word deliberate and sharp. "This is my home, and I need it quiet now." My nephew's face shifted slightly, the tension in his expression softening just a touch. He glanced at his friends and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "All right," he said quietly, his tone more serious now. "We'll stop." I didn't wait around to see if he actually meant it. I spun on my heel and marched back to the living room, my heart pounding in my chest. For the rest of the evening, the noise finally stopped. I collapsed onto the couch, exhaling deeply, trying to shake off the weight of the frustration that had been building up all night. It wasn't until much later, when everything had gone still, that I realized the silence felt strange. It was unsettling, like it was too quiet, like the calm was fragile. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting long streaks of light across the kitchen counter. I moved through my morning routine slowly, pouring my coffee with careful attention, trying to delay whatever conversation I was about to have with him. The silence in the apartment now felt like something on the edge of shattering. I heard the sound of his door opening before I saw him. His steps were slow, almost deliberate, and when he walked into the kitchen, his hair was tousled, and he looked completely unbothered, as if nothing had happened the night before. He didn't immediately acknowledge me, heading straight for the cupboard to grab a mug. "Morning," he said casually, his voice neutral, as though we hadn't just been at odds hours earlier. I set my mug down, crossing my arms, and watched him as he poured his coffee. "Morning," I muttered, my tone tight. He glanced up, noticing the look on my face. "What?" he asked, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips, like he already knew what was coming. I raised an eyebrow at him. "You're really going to act like nothing happened last night?" His smile widened a little, but he didn't respond. Instead, he took a leisurely sip of his coffee. I couldn't help but feel the irritation rise again. "You and your friends were ridiculously loud. I could hear everything, every word, every laugh, and that damn music. Don't even get me started on the music." He leaned back against the counter, cradling his mug in both hands, still so calm it almost annoyed me. "We weren't that bad," he shrugged, downplaying the whole situation. "Not that bad," I repeated, my voice a mix of disbelief and frustration. "I came into your room 3 times to ask you to turn it down. And every time, it just got louder." For a moment, his expression softened, and I thought I saw a flicker of guilt in his eyes. Okay, he said, his voice more subdued now. "We might have gotten a little carried away." I put my hands on my hips, refusing to let him off the hook so easily. "Carried away? You and your friends turned my apartment into a nightclub. I don't know how you didn't expect me to snap." He sighed, setting his mug down with a soft clink. "I get it.
I'm sorry."
I'll make sure it doesn't happen again." I narrowed my eyes, studying his face closely, looking for any sign of insincerity. "You'd better mean that," I said, my voice steady and firm. He nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I do." After that, the rest of the morning passed quietly for the most part. He disappeared back into his room, and I took the opportunity to start cleaning up the living room. There were signs of last night's chaos everywhere, crumpled blankets on the couch, an empty soda can half hidden under the coffee table, a plate with leftover crumbs on the side table. I cleaned meticulously, trying to focus on the task at hand and not on the lingering frustration that still gnawed at me. But as I put the last pillow back on the couch, an uneasy feeling crept up on me. It wasn't just the noise that bothered me. It was his complete calmness, the way he could act like everything was fine, like he hadn't just pushed me to the edge. Later that afternoon, he emerged from his room, still wearing that same unbothered expression. "Need anything from the store?" he asked casually, as if nothing had happened. I blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the question. "No," I replied slowly, trying to understand why he'd asked.
"Why?"
"I was gonna grab a few things," he shrugged. "Thought I'd check." His casual demeanor made me wonder if maybe I'd overreacted. Maybe it hadn't been as bad as I'd thought. But then I remembered the 4th time I'd walked into his room, how my frustration had boiled over, and I felt my annoyance surge again. "Just make sure you actually keep it quiet next time," I said, my tone firm and final. He nodded, his expression serious. "Understood." By the evening, the apartment had fallen into an unusual, almost eerie calm. He spent most of the day in his room, and I found myself pacing the living room, restless and unsettled. The confrontation earlier had left me on edge, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't handling things the right way. When he finally came out again, it was with an air of lightness. "I made dinner," he said, gesturing toward the kitchen. I blinked, a little thrown off. "You made dinner?" I asked, surprised. Yeah, he repeated, a faint smirk appearing. It's not much, but I figured it's the least I could do after last night. Curiosity got the best of me, and I followed him into the kitchen. There, on the counter, was a simple spread, pasta salad, and a loaf of bread he must have picked up from the store. It wasn't extravagant, but the gesture caught me off guard. You didn't have to do this, I said, my tone softening. I know, he replied, his voice casual yet sincere. But for some reason, I wanted to. For the first time that day, the tension between us seemed to ease. We sat down to eat, and for a while, the conversation flowed easily. He told me about his plans for the week, and I shared a few work stories. It almost felt normal, almost comfortable. As the night wore on, I found myself thinking about the day. Despite how rocky things had started, there was something about his presence that seemed to be shifting the atmosphere in the apartment. He was still strange, still unsettling at times, but it wasn't all bad. As I cleared the dishes, he leaned against the counter, watching me with that faint smile of his. So, he said, breaking the silence. Are we good now? I glanced at him, caught off guard by the question. I guess, I answered, a reluctant smile tugging at my lips. He grinned in response.
Good.
I'll try not to get on your nerves too much. I rolled my eyes, but couldn't help the slight smile that followed. Just keep it down next time, I said, shaking my head. Deal, he said, raising his hands in mock surrender. With that, the unease that had been hanging over us finally began to fade. The next week passed in a blur, but the strange undercurrent in the apartment remained. The night of the party stayed with me, not just because of the noise, but because of the way he'd handled everything so calmly, without a hint of concern. He was young, sure, but it felt like he knew exactly how to push my buttons and pull back just before crossing the line. One evening, after an especially draining day at work, I came home to find the apartment eerily quiet. The silence was almost unsettling. I dropped my bag by the door, kicked off my shoes, and glanced around. His shoes were neatly placed by the wall, an almost subtle reminder that he was home. Hey, I called out, my voice echoing a little. In here, came his reply, muffled but enough to guide me to the living room. He was stretched out on the couch, a book in hand. It was a surprise. He usually spent his evenings out or glued to his phone. The sight of him lost in a novel made me pause for a second. You read? I asked, genuinely curious. He looked up, smirking. Everyone reads. You think I'm illiterate? I rolled my eyes but smiled despite myself. It's just surprising. What's the book? He held it up, showing me the cover. It was a classic I'd read years ago, one I remembered liking but hadn't touched since college. Interesting choice, I said, moving to sit on the armchair across from him. It's good, he said. Makes you think. I leaned back, watching him for a moment. He didn't strike me as the type to sit still long enough for a book like that, but there he was, turning the pages with a focus that didn't quite fit the image I had of him. Later that evening, as I worked at the kitchen table, he appeared again. This time, he leaned against the counter, watching me with an unreadable expression. Long day, he asked. Always, I replied, not looking up from my laptop. You work too much, he said lightly, but there was something else in his tone. I work enough, I countered. You're always like this, he said, his arms crossed, eyes fixed on me. Like the world's going to fall apart if you don't keep everything perfectly in line. His words caught me off guard, but I try not to show it. That's how life works, I said. You don't get anywhere by sitting around hoping things will fall into place. He tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. When was the last time you just let yourself enjoy something? I scoffed and waved a hand dismissively. I enjoy things all the time. Name one, he challenged, his tone sharp. The irritation in his voice got under my skin. I don't need to justify myself to you, I said, finally looking up at him. His expression didn't change, though it softened a little. I'm not asking you to, he said quietly. I'm just saying, maybe you don't always have to try so hard. The words hung in the air, heavier than I'd expected. I wanted to brush them off, to tell him he didn't know what he was talking about. But truthfully, they struck a nerve. The next day, I came home to find a small note taped to the fridge. It was written in his messy handwriting. "Dinner's on the table. Don't work too late." I frowned, pulling the note off the fridge and glancing toward the dining table. Sure enough, there was a plate covered in foil, pasta, salad, and bread. It was simple, but the gesture threw me off. When he came out of his room later that evening, I confronted him. "What's this about?" I asked, holding up the note. He shrugged. "You were late. Figured you'd forget to eat otherwise." His tone was casual, but there was something deeper behind it, something unsaid. It wasn't just about the food. It was about the things we didn't talk about, the unspoken understanding between us. "You don't have to take care of me," I said softly. "I know," he replied, "but maybe someone should." As the week went on, I started noticing more of these small gestures. Tea left for me in the mornings, the trash taken out without me asking, the blanket folded neatly after I'd left it in a heap. They were quiet, almost invisible actions, but they added up. It wasn't until Friday evening that the tension finally seemed to crack. I came home to find him sitting at the kitchen table, a glass of water in his hand. He looked up when I entered, his expression serious. "Can I ask you something?" he asked. I hesitated, but nodded, setting my bag on the counter. "What is it?" "Are you happy?" he asked, the bluntness of the question stopping me cold. I froze, completely caught off guard. "What kind of question is that?" I stammered. He didn't flinch. He just looked at me, calm and unbothered. "Just curious." I tried to laugh it off. "Of course I'm happy. Why wouldn't I be?" His gaze didn't waver. "You don't seem like it." I stared at him, suddenly unsure of what to say. His expression remained unchanged, patient, but unyielding. And for the first time, I couldn't answer him. That night, as I lay in bed, his question echoed in my mind. It wasn't just the words. It was how he'd said them, as if he already knew the answer. Maybe deep down I did too. The weekend arrived with a strange kind of stillness. The air in the apartment felt heavier, charged, like the calm before a storm. I woke up later than usual, sunlight already filtering through the curtains. For the first time in weeks, something about the morning felt different. The apartment was unusually still as I shuffled into the kitchen. When I walked in, I found him already awake, sitting at the table, cradling his coffee mug. He looked up when I entered, offering a quiet, almost secretive smile. Something in his expression was different. Softer, more introspective, as though he'd been waiting for me. "Morning," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Morning," I replied, heading straight for the coffee pot. It felt like a routine, something familiar that should have brought me comfort, but there was a strange undercurrent of tension in the air. We sat in silence for a while, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Then I caught him watching me. His gaze was steady, almost like he was analyzing me, but in a way that wasn't uncomfortable. "What?" I asked, putting my mug down and meeting his gaze. He paused, as if deciding whether to speak, then leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the table. "I've been thinking," he started, his voice low and measured. "Maybe this whole situation hasn't been the easiest for you. Having me around, I mean." I blinked, not expecting him to bring this up. "It's fine," I said quickly, though my words felt empty even as they left my mouth. He looked at me with an expression that told me he didn't believe me. "You don't have to pretend," he said gently. "I know I've made things complicated." I opened my mouth to argue, but he raised his hand, stopping me. "It's okay," he said softly. "I'm not trying to make you feel bad. I just think it's time I figure things out on my own." The words hung in the air, heavier than I anticipated. My instinct was to agree with him, to tell him that he was right, and that it might be better if he left. But as I opened my mouth, something unexpected bubbled up instead. "You don't have to leave," I said, surprising both of us. He raised an eyebrow slightly, though his face remained composed. "It's not about needing to leave," he replied, his voice steady. "It's about what's best for both of us." I frowned, a tight feeling in my chest. "You think I don't want you here?" "No," he said simply. "I think you're afraid to want anyone here." The words hit me harder than I expected. Not just because of the truth they carried, but because of how they were spoken. No judgment, just a quiet understanding. I looked away, unable to hold his gaze. "You think you have me all figured out?" I muttered, my voice barely audible. "No," he said calmly, "but I think I understand you more than you realize." His honesty made it impossible for me to argue, and for a long time, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was thick with unspoken thoughts, the weight of everything hanging there. Later, as I cleared the dishes from dinner, he appeared in the doorway. He leaned against the frame, watching me with that same unreadable expression. "I'm going out for a bit," he said, breaking the silence. "Where to?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. "Just a walk," he replied. "Clear my head." I nodded without speaking, my throat tight. He lingered for a moment, as though waiting for me to stop him, but I stayed silent. When the door closed behind him, the apartment felt impossibly quiet again. I stood there, staring at the empty space where he had been, feeling like time itself had stretched and warped. Each second felt longer than the last. The unease inside me grew, and I found myself pacing, checking my phone for missed calls. I dialed his number, but it went straight to voicemail. The minutes passed slowly, dragging into what felt like hours. It wasn't until after midnight that I heard the door creak open, a sound that yanked me out of my restless thoughts. He stepped inside, looking tired, his eyes a little distant. "Sorry," he said immediately, noticing the tension in my expression. I lost track of time. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "You could have called." "I didn't think it would matter much," he said, his voice light, but there was something hidden in the way he spoke. I didn't answer at first. My mind was racing, caught somewhere between relief and frustration. Finally, I looked up at him, and with more sincerity than I intended, I said, "Of course I care." He froze, his eyes searching mine in a way I wasn't prepared for. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "I'm glad." That night, as I lay in bed, I kept replaying the day in my mind, his words, his actions, the way everything had unfolded. I realized then, maybe for the first time, that he hadn't just disrupted my life. He had reminded me of what it was to let someone in, what it felt like to share space, time, and a world with someone else. And while the thought scared me, it also felt strangely comforting. As sleep finally began to pull me under, I whispered into the dark room, "Maybe I needed this more than I thought." For the first time in a long while, the quiet of the apartment felt less like an absence and more like a presence, a gentle, softening silence.